was, sitting in my very first university class. I had done all the pre-reading, memorizing, name, dates, key figures, events, you name it, and I was ready for the professor to ask me anything. Except that he turned around and said to me, Anya, what do you think? I stared back at him blankly. It was in this moment that I had a crashing realization that my entire schooling experience up to then had prepared me to memorize and to take tests, even effectively, but it had not prepared me to think for myself. And this reality is certainly not unique to me. In fact, keeping exams and tests at the center of the teaching and learning experience is rampant across Pakistan's education systems, whether that's an elite private school or a government school or a low-cost private school. Unsurprisingly, though, the implications are far worse for low-income students who make up 90% of our school-going population. They tend to have parents that are illiterate. They have limited to no access to the internet, to television, to basically opportunities that can help them develop alternative ways of learning and thinking, anything that's outside of what the classroom offers them. The World Bank describes learning poverty as the percentage of 10-year-olds that can't read and understand a simple story. According to their estimates, 75% of Pakistani children fall into this category. 75%. Interestingly enough, up to the age of 10, enrollment rates are the highest in Pakistan. So that means the students are actually in school. In fact, the students that are not learning how to read are not only enrolled, but they're progressing from one grade to the next based on their performance on a single high-stakes exam. So then how is it that they don't learn how to read? I believe that a fundamental reason for this ongoing learning crisis is our approach to assessments. And by that I mean the way we use exams and tests as the only way to measure student learning. Before I get into how we can revise and reform this approach, I want us to take a closer look at the implications the current assessment approach has on key stakeholders of education. For the past 12 years, I have been working with and researching key education stakeholders, including students, their parents, and teachers. And I have found that all three of them share in the struggle at the hands of our current assessment approach. Now let's take a deeper look. From my interviews with students, I have consistently learned that what they're learning in the classroom is exactly what they need for the exam. In fact, when they're raising their hands to ask questions that are diverging from the lesson, they are often reprimanded for doing so. Their one job is to be able to take that exam and to pass it. And it does not matter how they do it, and it certainly doesn't matter whether they understand the content. Unsurprisingly, this leads to very high dropout rates. In fact, 22 million children are out of school in Pakistan. And this number puts us second in line as having the highest rates of out of school children in the world. Next, let's look at parents. From my time with them, I have learned that they define their children's learning success by how the child performs on an exam. And this is because every time they go to school and inquire about how their child is faring, they're repeatedly told, go and look at your child's report card. So now when the child doesn't perform well on exams, parents are found to be encouraged to pull their child out of school. This, of course, then contributes to the high dropout rates. Last but not least, let's look at teachers. From my time with them, I have consistently learned that they feel burdened, pressured, and even intimidated by the sheer volume of syllabi they have to finish just so that the children can take exams. This assessment culture is so deeply ingrained in our collective psyche that a child's future prospects and the way we define and understand their intelligence all boils down to a single letter grade or a number grade. Do you think it's fair for us to evaluate our children this way? I believe we as a society need to reflect deeply and reevaluate and reassess what we value in education. Now let's turn to what can be done. We need to reform our examination and testing culture. This is not a new idea, and neither is it novel, but I believe it can be revolutionary in Pakistan's context. First, we need to end high stakes exams. I'm aware that this may not be a realistic possibility in our near future, especially given that the majority of our students take the metric exam, which gives them entry into higher education as well as employment. But ending high stakes exams needs to be our end goal and one that we work backwards from. So, what can we be doing now and on a continuous basis? I believe that schools can use a blended assessment approach. By this, I mean you combine formative assessments, for which students receive no grades, with summative assessments, for which students do receive a grade, to produce a weighted average. And by this, I simply mean that one single exam can no longer be used to determine a child's ability to progress to the next grade, and neither can we use one exam anymore to evaluate and define a child's intelligence. This is especially key for early years because it can encourage children to have a healthier relationship with learning, where their inability to perform well on a single test does not determine whether they will continue with their education. In fact, I think if we can prioritize such a reform across our primary years of schooling, we can increase the likelihood of our 10-year-olds becoming literate. This shift from focusing on a high stakes single event, it gives students not only the opportunity to demonstrate their own learning in a multitude of ways, but in fact, they will have to learn on a continuous basis, which is how the real world works. Such an approach also removes the excessive burden off the teachers. They don't just have to finish the syllabi to be able to ensure their children pass exams. Now they have agency and freedom to prioritize learning. You'll find that teachers have time to be able to invest in creating differentiated lesson plans, in adopting a variety of methods to assess their students rather than having to stick to just one. So how do we bring about this reform? We need to involve the same key stakeholders in education: students, their parents, and teachers. In fact, many of you or your family or your friends must be at least one, if not two, of these stakeholders yourselves. So now let's look at students first. We need to involve them in our process of revising our assessment approach. After all, they're at the center of learning. We need to ask them what works for them. How do they best learn rather than doing things to them? Focus groups and interviews with students are a great starting point. Next, let's look at parents. We need to invest in school-based initiatives and community-based programs that can help parents disassociate learning from performance on single examinations. We need to position literacy and well-being as only possible through healthy learning environments that are not tied to single units of measurement. Last but not least, teachers. We need to take a long look at our current curriculum as well as our upcoming single national curriculum and ask, do the lesson plans embed formative assessments? Do we prioritize activity-based and project-based learning? And simultaneously, we also need to invest in teacher professional development so that they can be upskilled on the use of formative assessments, and also so we can enable them to shift their mindsets about the value of learning coming through an exam only. The way we center our entire teaching and learning experiences on tests and exams currently is just not working. With COVID-19 and school closures, the World Bank now estimates that the percentage of 10-year-olds in Pakistan who will be unable to read and understand a simple story will only increase from 75% to almost 80%. And what's more, they're also projecting that almost 1 million students will drop out of school, many of whom are not convinced of the value of being enrolled because they're not learning how to read or write. And the millions that have gone back already will struggle to keep up, trying to make up for the gap in their learning so that they can pass exams. To enable schools, governments, and international organizations to reform their thinking on assessments and reimagine what they value in education, my co-founder and I began the Maple Advisory Group, where we believe that all children can learn if we create enabling environments for them to do so. We at the Maple Advisory Group believe that millions of 10-year-olds in Pakistan can learn how to read and understand and think for themselves, but only if we take a long and hard look at what we value in education. Is it the student's ability to perform on a test that they're taught to take? Or is it their ability to think for themselves, a skill that is required to not only survive but thrive in today's globalizing world? So, what do you think? Thank you.